Welcome to another episode of the Thunderstock Show. It's a collection of valuable brainstorms to enhance your life, liberty, and pursuit of property. Today's special guest is a fellow Pro Advisors Harrisburg 1 member, David Fitzsimons. David, thank you for making the drive to join me in person.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
David, tell me about how you started in the legal field.
Well, it goes back to high school where people were always saying to me, you ought to be a lawyer. And eventually when I was in law school, I realized that might not have been a compliment. They were just wishing I would shut up. But, I had always had interest in legal type interactions, and I was growing up in Annapolis, Maryland, and actually my big breakthrough came, I was waiting tables at a restaurant that I'd been working at for a few years, and I had a regular customer who liked my tableside cooking and asked me what I was planning to do with my future, and I told him, well, I'd really like to go to law school, but I don't really know how to get there. And it turns out he was a lawyer.
No way.
And so he hired me to work in his law firm a couple summers in college, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And
that's a bit far off from Annapolis.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, he had a boat.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and so he kind of was that that miracle intervention that helped me move forward. First member of my family to go to college and all that. And,
okay. Where'd you go to college at?
I started at Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold, Maryland, right outside Annapolis, and then I finished my 4 year at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland, and then I came up to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to what was then Dickinson School of Law, and now is Penn State Dickinson Law.
Oh, I didn't even realize Dickinson wasn't the name anymore.
Well, it's Penn State Dickinson Law. Back in, I'm going to say 98 or so. I'm getting the years wrong, but Dickinson, as a private law school, was looking for a partner, and Penn State, as one of the 12 schools of the Big Ten,
right,
was the only school that didn't have a law school. So
it geographically made a lot of sense.
Right. And there's been some wrinkles in the experience, but it's all good now, and I'm still active with the law school that I graduated from. I live 3 blocks away.
Oh, that's easy.
Work with trial advocacy and help students out as much as we can.
So you had this sort of built-in internship, which I
Yes.
think that I'd guess, many college-age students don't get as fortunate. That might be a tough step to go from the classroom to the actual practice. So what was it like having that exposure, and what are the things you learned early on from that internship experience?
Looking back, it was the best experience you could have had, the opportunity to be in a working law firm and to get to do some things that lawyers were kind of moving away from the lawyers doing the work and staffers. I did a lot of title searches. This is in the late 1970s.
Right.
No cell phones, not even computers. So the most up-to-date stuff in the office was those old IBM Selectrics that could record 300 characters as someone was typing. Probably way before your time.
Xerox, right?
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, those mimeograph machines that you hand cranked were still around. But over the years, that experience, even though the technology that's in use today in courts, and it's always a great foundation. And learning if this is a field you want to be in is always great.
Yeah, my college experience was I did a student, what do you want to call it when you're a high school senior? You get to go and check out the career path and work half the day. I always wanted to be what I thought was a teacher and a coach. And I loved the experience when I was a high school senior, so then I went to school to be a teacher. Problem was, as soon as it became halfway through my undergraduate degree, I was like, I do not want to be a teacher. But I spent half of my education accumulating the credits and doing it.
Right.
So it's great that you had that try before you buy experience.
Yeah.
I did talk to my advisor at the time. With philosophy degree, there was a high likelihood that law school was like a decent job.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I said, and my philosophy professor, I'm still friends with to this day, I said, I think maybe I'll use my degree to like try and get into law school. Like I like philosophy and I like the logic aspect. I was a tutor for the LSAT in my undergrad. So like, maybe I'll do that. And he goes, do you think that you're going to be in one of the top law firms? I said, no. He goes, do you think that you'll be in the top of your class at the law firm? I said, probably not. He goes, do you love law more than anything? I said, no. He's like, then you'd be better off doing something entirely different because once you get on that path, you're on the path. So anyway, that was my background, but it's great to hear someone that like went 2 feet in and went through the process. What was it like going from undergrad to law school?
Law school was a shock. And I think it is for a lot of people because pretty much everybody you go into law school with is used to being at the top end of where they just came from, and now half of you aren't.
Right.
And it's a very different. Again, when I was in law school, it's a lot different today. I think law school education today is more people focused.
Okay.
When I was in law school, it was around the time that a famous movie on law school had been out called The Paper Chase.
Okay.
Look it up sometime.
Yeah.
And there was a famous sarcastic professor named Professor Kingsfield who took no pleasure at all in abusing students, but did it anyway. And a whole part of the movie was, the natural selection hell, if you will, of law school. So when my generation got to law school, we're culling the herd. Look to your left, look to your right. Not everybody's going to be here. That was the whole ethos of everything. Whereas today, I think it's more realistic, in the sense that it's a great investment of time and today money to go to law school.
Right.
My tuition in law school seemed expensive at the time, but compared to what students are looking at today, is frankly minuscule. And so the investment of time and treasure is considerable. And I think the education has broadened more. They used to teach you to think like a lawyer, and now it's more what they call practice ready.
Okay.
So there's a lot more clinic work and actual exposure to real people during your education. So I think, and I work at my alma mater as a adjunct in trial advocacy and sometimes do presentations on mediation. And I think the students today are more well-rounded and invested in the education.
It sounds like today's education may be focused on real-world preparedness, whereas it sounds like maybe the I don't want to say Darwinian approach of survival of the fittest was more academic or scholastic excellence. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that's, I would say that's a fair assessment from my perspective.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm sure you could find people who would disagree.
This is not legal advice.
Right. Yeah.
I make that joke whether I'm talking to people that are in the finance or investment.
Yeah.
This is not investment advice.
Right.
This is not legal advice. Very funny. So you mentioned the influence of popular culture, the movie, and how that sort of affected the ethos at the time. I will tell you with zero shame that as much as I don't have a litigious bone in my body, and I never went past tutoring for the LSAT for the legal field, I've spent many an hour watching the show Suits. Are you familiar with that show?
Only by name.
Okay, so the premise of the show is, my name is Ross. One of the main characters' name is Ross. Like instant, affinity towards that character. But this person was I don't want to say idiot savant, but just an absolute super genius, like 170 IQ minimum, for whatever that's worth, and had this photographic memory where if he read a book, he retained it verbatim. Probably helpful for law, great thing. But he got caught cheating in college and they expelled him. Okay, and then he got mixed up at a law firm where he was running from trouble, and one of the main senior legal professionals, associates, was interviewing, and he ended up in the interview room, and he's like, "You're awesome. I want to hire you." He goes, I don't have my degree. Like I didn't pass the bar." He goes, "That's fine." So then he spent 6 seasons or however many seasons of the show, like posing as a lawyer, but not legally able to practice law. I'm like, anyway, that show to me, the reason I bring it up and think about that is because it almost makes being in law like seem super cool. Like you're just like, might as well be a pro athlete when you're doing that. Mm-hmm. But I also think that might be misleading to the general public because people watch that show and be like, I'm pretty smart. I can remember things. I'm going to be as, wearing these tailored suits and dining at the Ritz-Carlton type, the highest end places, and everything's going to be great. But what's the reality, the real world, somewhere in between those two ends, I think.
Yeah, it's in my household, there's a quiet truce that I don't watch trial shows on TV with people around because nothing's right. Waving, that's not an objection. You can't do that. Those kind of things happen. And I think anybody who has a pursuit where they really know what they're doing, mm-hmm. television's version of what they do is, come on now. In some respects.
Mad Men would be the example for me.
Yeah. Police shows, fire shows, hospital medical procedurals. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're there to entertain, and they show the high points. They don't, a 1-hour show of somebody sitting on a computer researching cases before the trial that's 3 months from now probably isn't good television. The challenges of client representation, don't, again, make for good television, but you make an interesting point about, members of the public see things on TV.
And they're influenced.
And then they get on a jury, and why aren't you interesting like those people on TV? Well, because if I did what the lawyers in court on TV get away with, the judge would have me escorted out of the room. Mm-hmm. Or, for one, in Cumberland County, where I live just a few years ago, the DA was instrumental in getting a CSI unit developed within the county. Because, we have to face reality that juries have been watching the CSI shows on television for years. And they expect you to be able to pick up a sample at a crime scene and get a reading on it before the next commercial break. Whereas,
the process is infinitely more involved.
Exactly. So, in some sense, I think there's been some adaptation to what jurors expect. I think it's fair to say that people's attention spans these days are not considered to be as long as they were in the past. So what I tell students when we're working on trial issues in an advocacy class is don't do what the lawyers on television are doing, but keep in mind that you're presenting a story. You're the director of your client's position here, and understand the need to move and, in a sense, entertain and engage the members of the jury and or the judge or the arbitrators, depending on where you are.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they're non-fiction storytellers, right? Because you need to consider all the facts.
Storytelling is when I started in law school, the trial advocacy portion was all about, obviously, the evidentiary details and how to move around in court and how to get an exhibit in. I mean, you have to know the mechanics. But the way trials are presented today is all about storytelling and having a theme and understanding what your client's position is and presenting it in that sense. which frankly morphs into what I do now as a mediator.
Sure.
Is oftentimes if you have a dispute and you have a trial coming up, you finally get to tell your story. Except evidentiary rules sometimes get in the way. You can't always say what you want to say because it's hearsay or because it's not relevant, but it's what's on your mind. And lawyers now are recognizing that sometimes if their client can be sitting with them with a mediator and telling their story, it helps them process and then move to working towards a solution. You know, I tell people that in court, the judge is going to decide, the jury and or the judge are going to decide your case. And in law school, we had a course called remedies. So the remedies for the wrong that was done to you are one of these following three things. But if we're in a mediation with two parties in a dispute who may or may not be represented by attorneys, the remedies are way more than the legal remedies. Sometimes people have a relationship that is at risk because of the dispute. Family business.
Sure.
A supplier and a manufacturer. All sorts of different disputes arise in commerce or in life with organizations that you might need in the future. So alternatives to trial, such as mediation, are becoming more popular because they can be less expensive and they can save relationships as well as addressing conflicts.
I want to get into the details of mediation, but before I ask line of questioning there, do me a favor and help me bridge from, while you're in law schools, you knew you wanted to do law.
Right.
But you didn't, I'm assuming you didn't necessarily know you wanted to do mediation.
Right.
So how did the mediation trajectory or pathway come to be? Like, was it like you were interested in law in general, and then, while you were in school, you picked a lane and you studied in it, or did you practice other areas beforehand?
My experience, I think, is pretty common, but every individual. Some people go to law school. I'm going to be a tax lawyer.
Sure.
Okay. Good for you. Not for me. Thank you. But off they went.
Yeah.
And again, when I was in law school, it was more about the teaching you to think like a lawyer side. And mediation was basically just in its infancy when I was in law school. So we had a dean at the law school when I was there. This is the early 1980s, who was very much interested in mediation, but it wasn't anywhere near mainstream at that point anywhere. Okay. Especially within the law. Mediation was developed by sociologists and psychologists for conflict resolution. Neighborhoods and cultural disputes and things like that. Okay. And then it got picked up by the law later down the road. But when I was in school, again, they train you how to be a lawyer, and probably my fault was I didn't really have an end plan. I just knew I needed to get a law degree to be a lawyer. Sure. And my first job was actually at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and in that job, I got assigned to procurement and construction cases, and I discovered construction law, which I really enjoyed. And I've done construction law my whole career. And in construction law, especially commercial construction, the contracts usually call for mediation as either an alternative to trial or as a prerequisite. You must try to mediate before you can go to court. Now, as someone that has dealt with marketing contracts, some very loose and probably in front of you be like, this is drivel or not, withstanding. But some were airtight and written by lawyers. In the most extreme of legal binding contracts, there was a call for arbitration. So can you explain to me, someone with my limited understanding of the law, differences between arbitration and mediation in contract disputes?
businesses?
So arbitration, as you pointed out in a contract, would be essentially private judging. So an arbitrator, and I sometimes serve as an arbitrator is sitting in judgment and makes a decision. So the contract you described, a marketing contract, the parties, when they negotiated this contract, were in agreement. We don't want to go to court. We don't want to be suing each other in court. We want to keep it private, which is one of the advantages of arbitration. We want it to be quick and efficient, which can happen in arbitration. Sometimes it doesn't.
Sure.
And then we want to move on. So that's one of the reasons why people get sold on arbitration. Arbitration is always final. There's no appeals process and things like that. So it can be, arbitrators are very powerful, but they're given their power in the contract that goes in there. A mediator, different from an arbitrator, is a neutral who's there to facilitate discussion. On my website, I say mediation is a conversation. And oftentimes the mediator's job is to get people talking. Or sometimes the mediator is the first time you've gotten to tell your story without interruption to somebody who, if doing it properly, you perceive as a neutral without a dog in the fight.
Right.
Whereas in court, in depositions, when you're in a conflict with someone, how often are you listening to them when they're talking? You're thinking about what you're about to say in response.
In conflict, someone that has we expressed off camera, you played rugby before, and that's a form of legitimate, organized conflict, right? It's a contact sport.
But there are rules.
But there are rules you have to follow. And if you want to talk to somebody who spent more time in the sin bin than me, good luck.
Right.
I was in the sin bin often.
Yeah.
But I was a cage fighter. So the idea of conflict, I found that the vast majority of population, when conflict arises, tensions go up.
Yep.
Heartbeats per minute, and your heart rate goes up. Your cackles, you're on your defensive. It's fight or flight sometimes. It's very reptilian brain, self-preservation, and I don't think most people present the best in conflict.
No, exactly.
And I don't want to say I'm in any way, shape, or form unique or genetically different, but through my repeated exposure of actual physical altercation, I think that it's just very exciting, and I pay more attention. Now, I don't know if that would present well in court, but I think that for most people, you're absolutely right. They just present maybe their worst self when it's just direct conflict. But for some people, maybe that's why I had an interest in being a lawyer at some point, because I was like, oh, it's this conflict on the daily. But then, how do you navigate the emotional side of this? That's why I tell the story, right? Because it's definitely tricky.
No, and I think you're right. One of the developing evolutions in my career is, I love a good argument, and I'm pretty good at it.
Yeah.
And I enjoy being in court, and I've had clients pay me the ultimate left-handed compliment. Boy, you were better than I thought you'd be.
On one hand, it's great. On the other hand, what do you think I was going to be?
Right, but okay. It's not a cage fight, but once you walk into the courtroom, your client can be a very sophisticated business person who's a much better entrepreneur and financial and everything mind than you are. But you walk into that courtroom with those Abraham Lincoln quotes on the wall and the judge in the black robe.
That's your cage.
And the jury and a lot of very comfortable, confident business persons who are clients, they freeze in there because as much as we don't talk Latin anymore, and things are less formal, and you see it all on television. It's when you're in there.
But if you needed to talk Latin, David, you could.
Right, and
that helps.
Yeah, but your lawyer is the person representing you in that fight, and they know how to address your arguments. And of course, the judge is there is a referee, and the jury are the judges. They keep score. Well, the jury is the fact finder, and the judge is applying the law to the facts that the jury finds. And so it's a very formalized process, and that's why one reason why some businesses will choose arbitration, because it's less formal and it's quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But then the allure of mediation is that it most often is definitely less expensive than litigation. And litigation is a zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. And sometimes the party that has the winning verdict hasn't necessarily won. I mean, you can try a case and win $10,000. That's what the jury. I was in a case where a jury awarded $10,000 against my client, and that's exactly what my client had offered 3 years ago.
But then they lost 3 years of time and stress and emotional turmoil, essentially.
And the side that won the case put in a petition for legal fees of $160,000, and the judge laughed him out of court. So we know they spent $160,000 to win 10 that they could have had 3 years ago. Now that's an extreme example, but it's the type.
But it's a real story.
It's the type of challenge that you face when you get into litigation. Because like you said, you get into the litigation. It's not fight or flight. It's fight. Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were pointing out, the hippocampus and the amygdala drive our neurology. I read more neurology now and psychology than law.
Right.
Because
that's where mediation came from, sort of.
Exactly. and in mediation, you're looking at, oftentimes you bring parties into a mediation who have been in a knockdown drag out for a while. Mm-hmm. They might have been they're in litigation for 3 years and they don't have a trial date yet. And the only thing they both agree on is, we'd like this to end. Sometimes, and I've had my own clients when I was in mediation who, they're not really remembering why it is they were so mad 2 years ago when they called me. And part of that evolution I started this with is I started to realize that the legal professionals were enjoying the case more than our clients were. And so I started to get engaged with some friends and colleagues, getting engaged in inquiring into getting training to be mediators and to start using mediation as a more organic, if you will, way to help client solutions.
To get to resolution.
Yeah.
Right? Because like you said earlier with the litigious aspect of the nature of the profession, like if the lawyers are the ones that win and enjoy it the most, then that means that the clients aren't the ones that win and enjoy it the most.
Yeah.
And it seems like mediation is a way to use your skill set and experience to maybe the term client advocacy isn't the best, but maybe it is.
What you're describing is what I see as an evolution in the profession and representing clients. The name of my company, ADR Fitz, Alternative Dispute Resolution. For 30 years, mediation and arbitration and other methods of neutral work have been considered alternatives to the traditional Anglo-American system of trial by jury. And what's happening now through legal ethics rules, through best practices for attorneys, through good experience, is it's not so much an alternative now, it's just part of the toolkit. 20 years ago, a judge would say to lawyers a week before trial, go see a mediator. So you'd be mediating a case that they're already literally mediating on the courthouse steps. Whereas now I have lawyers who contact me before they filed a complaint, and they're working with another lawyer that they respect, and they're like, well, why don't we try mediation before we pull the trigger on go to court or filing a complaint? So they're at all different stages of conflict now where parties are starting to look towards the alternatives. And not every case is ideal for mediation, and not every case settles in mediation. But if it's done properly, I've seen many cases, my own cases, and then the cases I've mediated. We might not get it done today, Wednesday, but next Thursday, I'll get a call saying the case settled. That old phrase, let me sleep on it.
Yeah, it works.
Neurologically, it's been shown it actually works. That's what dreams are, sorting out what's happening in your life and fixing things.
Yeah, and then the transverse of dreams, the nightmares.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's when the bills come in.
Yeah, that's when the litigators are like, "Oh, a nightmare? Let's fix this." No, I'm just kidding. That's not like
yeah. Yeah, we can sue somebody for that. Yeah.
Man, that's such an interesting way to look at law. So, I want to go back to like a case study without using any names or any specific identifiables. But I had worked with a client that had signed a marketing agreement I mentioned before, and the beginning of my engagement with the client as their marketer was essentially to what I often do as a fractional CMO now, which was one of my first forays into doing this, was to get a hold of the existing marketing vendors, understand first of all, I have to look at the contract, understand what is the agreement. We're paying X for what, Y, right? And when I looked at the agreement, I was like, this is unlike any marketing agreement I've ever seen, because the 25% of the entire 2-page document was fine print about the arbitration process. And when I analyzed it, which you had to have pretty good eyesight to read that text, it was like, hey, if you end this agreement is valid for 24 months. And if you end the agreement, then you owe us 24 months on top of what you've already paid. So it was like, you're charging $20,000 a month, which at the time was a very high retainer for marketing services. If I say that we don't want to go in this direction, then you're going to charge us $240,000. It goes to arbitration in your jurisdiction. And I was like, this is weird, right? This is unlike anything I've ever encountered. So then that had my question mark cap on. And I did some research on the members of the company, like what I could find on the digital profile. And the person that I thought was the office manager was disbarred from the state they were practicing law in. And the only time that I ever talked to that person was in relation to me understanding the contract. And I'm like, okay, well, what did you do to get disbarred? So then obviously, because that's kind of, I would assume it's a big deal in law. Like that's like you're blackballed for practicing. You can't be a lawyer if you're disbarred. She was involved in a fraud scheme with either real estate, mortgages, or commercial loans for real estate, where she embezzled or somehow procured like $2 million over several years of like not real agreed upon funds, like. And I'm like, oh, so that's who wrote this contract. And I, at the time, I guess to end the story or why I thought it was worth sharing, I was like, I've never been in a service agreement with a marketing agency that went through the arbitration process that I felt like we were doomed from the start, from the piece of paper you signed, even though I compiled 60 pages worth of notes. Here are the things that they said they were going to do. They did not do them. Like 60 pages of notes that took me a lot of time. I mean, I felt like I was paralegal as a marketer, just going through and analyzing the past history. And I don't know the outcome of that dispute, but I know that it took lots of legal fees, lots of time, and the only way that the person I represented as their marketer would have won is that they never would have signed it in the first place. So from where I'm sitting at, it sounds like what you do, given the option, my marketing client at the time would have much preferred, some sort of mediation, but then you have to take in consideration potentially bad actors.
There's a lot in that story. My first thing I would say is the first thing I ever look at in any contract is the disputes clause. Partly because of what I know. Sure. But what is the dispute resolution clause in the contract? And this isn't legal advice, but that sounds like a pretty punitive cancellation process. I'm a former member of the disciplinary board of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, so I know about.
You've seen cases of disbarment.
Yes, from the right side.
Yeah.
Regulation of lawyer behavior, and once you're disbarred, you shouldn't be writing contracts, but that's a whole other different story.
Sure.
But when you're looking at a contract and the disputes clause puts a big old hammer in one party's hands and nothing in the other party's hands, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm. Not sign.
You have to
Step one.
think really hard about whether you want to be in that deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had other incredibly informal contract work service agreements.
Yeah.
And one example, again, not identifiable, but one person goes, well, what if I break the agreement? And I said, well, I'm not going to sue you if that's what you're asking.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to pursue legal action. Although, my judgment would be that I could, because we have an agreement, but I'm telling you on the record, I'm not going to.
And you're not going to be invited to my podcast.
But that's the thing, is if you want to pursue the breaking of the agreement that we had, then I'm just going to choose willfully not to engage with business with you in the future. It's a burned bridge.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I think maybe I'm softer on the legal thing side for whatever reason I have, but there's people that I know that almost like want to get into disputes to win, either to prove a point more than just the recuperation of finances or whatever. And I guess where I'm trying to go with this thought is, for someone like me that doesn't want, like, I would rather just like eat the loss. Like, do I call people like you, David, for mediation, or like what is the course? Again, not legal advice, but like, is that an instance where mediation is a preferential course of action without giving advice?
Well, I think it's a strong option because, when you're a business person and you entered into an agreement and you've been providing services and the other side doesn't want to be there anymore, our reactions to that are natural, right? It's rejection. It's well, what's wrong with this? I've performed everything on my side of the fence. Why aren't you honoring our agreement? And the traditional remedies are: we had an agreement, I believe you've breached it, it's caused me damage, and I'm suing you. Those are the basic elements of breach of contract.
Right. Standard.
And invariably, well, I didn't breach the contract, you didn't deliver. Thunderstock did not do what Thunderstock was promised me.
Yeah, and in this instance, it was different. But
just hypothetically, those are the kind of things that go into it, and oftentimes, the last thing that's on either party's mind is, maybe both of our companies have grown in a different direction, and we don't belong with each other anymore. And sometimes that realization doesn't happen unless somebody's like you is like, why am I going to pursue this? Here's what I'm going to do. And I've had mediations where there are businesses that are separating that had a great relationship, and something has happened. And sometimes
you're almost like a detective. Yeah,
sometimes what causes the rift isn't what the lawyers get to write down in a complaint, the relevant legal issue. Sometimes it is just hey, there was a great relationship between two middle managers and the one guy moved to the West Coast.
Sure. And
all of a sudden things aren't meshing the way they used to be, and contract performance isn't the same, or maybe the expectations of one side to the agreement have changed, the business direction is changing, we're stuck with this contract.
Yeah, almost no fault, but we have a contract.
Right, and so, and one or both of those parties will consult with their attorneys, and today, I think more often than not, the attorneys will say, well, let's start by talking. And by talking, when I say let's talk, what I really mean is let's listen to each other. Because that's a thing, that's a factor that I think mediators bring to the puzzle sometimes is I'll be in the room with the parties talking like I'm talking to you right now, and the party that sued you is out of camera shot watching you and I talk, and instead of every time you talk thinking about what they're going to say in response to you, they become an observer of our conversation. And if I do it with you skillfully and you get to tell your story to me, I can see out of the corner of my eye, I can see body language changing, I can see when I turn to them and start asking them questions, instead of looking at you, if they're looking at me and responding to my questions, then we know the dynamic is becoming a three-way conversation. And whenever two people are talking and they're doing it, modeling good behavior
Sure.
and mutual regard, that has a tendency to take over in the room. And I've even seen pretty hard charging lawyers cool it a bit and start to mellow out a little as things go on.
You lead with your ears.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an interesting frame. So, how long have you been doing mediation?
I took my first formal training in 1999.
Okay.
But I was involved in mediations as a litigator representing parties for about 5 years before that. So I would say total about 35 years I've been involved. But formally training, I had a couple of professors who were teaching after I graduated, who were teaching mediation at the law school that I attended. And I told them I'm really enjoying this and I think I might be good at it and I'd love to do more. And they suggested I start taking training outside the Bar Association, the lawyers group, and go to some of the leaders in mediation thought who were not lawyers and takes it. So I started traveling and taking training from the psychologists and sociologists who have written very good books on the process of mediation and dispute resolution. And that's how I really got into it.
So mediation hasn't been around for 100 years.
It's 50 years at most.
Yeah, so for 35 to 50 years you've been in.
Yeah.
Huh. There's not many other ADR Fitzes that can say that.
Right. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
That's a unique position where you're at.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a tough sell sometimes because in Pennsylvania we don't have a formal structure for mediation.
Sure.
In a lot of states now, you can't get a trial date unless you have a letter from a certified mediator saying we've tried. Whereas in Pennsylvania, there's a bit of a patchwork of adoption in various counties, but it's really catching on amongst lawyers and judges and clients because it works.
So, a lot of our conversation and a lot of the examples we talk about have been, commercial. Like there's a dispute between a business owner and a provider, like you said before, manufacturer and distributor, whatever the relationship. But is mediation like a business to business and a business owner to business owner, or it can be much broader than that? Like, who are the types of people that you help most often?
Mediation is used in a broad variety of areas. Facilitated discussion between conflicting parties. So,
but not like a husband and wife divorce.
Always, absolutely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, mediation is very effective in family law.
Okay.
And there's a field of practice in family law called collaborative law, which involves lawyers who are specifically trained in mediation as part of their training to become a collaborative practitioner. And in collaborative law, the lawyers and the clients make an agreement with each other, which didn't used to be possible in the law, because for me to be representing somebody suing you, to be in a contract with you was considered improper. But in collaborative practice, the lawyers and the parties agree that they will follow a process that doesn't involve litigation. And that if anybody decides to file litigation, those lawyers can't represent those clients. The idea being that if you're
true neutral,
if you're you're still representing your client, but you're being so collaborative with everybody in the room that you learn things that you shouldn't really learn if there's going to be litigation.
Interesting.
It's not the most artful way that I've described that, but it'll do. So collaborative practice in some states expands even beyond family law. For instance, in Texas, collaborative law is used in commercial cases. And I think also in New York it's catching on. in Pennsylvania, the collaborative law statute allows the use of collaborative practice in all matters involving family disputes. So, for instance, a family business that's going through a rift, a generational turnover,
Sure.
or
maybe the second generation, there's a brother and a sister that have a
Yes.
dispute on
yes,
succession planning.
Parents who started a business are famously poor at deciding which kid should be in control of the
I mean,
of the books.
you want to
versus
talk about a
yeah.
conflict between your heart and your head. That's
Yes.
a tough spot to be, rightfully so.
Yeah, and then you need a neutral who understands the dynamics of birth order,
Mm-hmm.
and who got the red tricycle when we were kids. So it gets complicated. But so mediation in some countries, mediation is used in areas that you wouldn't really expect. They use mediation in the federal court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. Mediation is used in prisoner claims within the federal criminal prison system. So they bring in mediators to mediate claims by the prisoners against the prison authorities.
I have a question for you. So we referenced that the state-by-state laws differ.
Right.
Is there a geographic region in which that you serve clients? Is it national? Is it just Pennsylvania? Is there certain states you will and won't?
As a mediator, I work throughout Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
I have mediated cases where lawyers from outside of Pennsylvania are representing clients in a case involving Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
When, for instance, if there was a dispute in Maryland, I would have to check the Maryland statutes, because in Maryland, mediators are regulated.
Mm.
So anybody can call themselves a mediator in Pennsylvania, technically, because there's no regulation.
Like being a business broker.
Right.
You don't have,
Coach. I'm a coach.
Sure.
Now, and not disparaging coaches, because
But
I've worked with them and they can do a lot of good.
Yeah.
But
the barrier to entry is different.
Yeah, there is no regulatory scheme.
But that's one of the things that has you sort of standing out, is because you do have the background in law.
I've got a law degree, but also I've got specific certificates from different training courses, which hopefully demonstrate that I've taken the time and the effort to train outside of the straight who struck John of practicing law. And lawyers aren't known for listening respectfully when the other side is telling their story. Our job, cynically, our job is to interrupt and
objection.
Yeah. Why are you objecting? Well, because he was making a good point. I need to stop it. That's not really the way it's done, but it happens that way. And in mediation, formally training as a mediator affected the way I practice law. I think for the better.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of my clients didn't think so, because I wasn't as obnoxious as I used to be. But you're not as much of a fighter anymore. You're seeing too much of the other side. Well, they might have been right. I was learning a new path.
I get it, but at the same time, for whatever my opinion is worth on the topic, it seems like taking the objective. One of the phrases I love is, "There's your story, my story, and the truth."
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, that might not apply in a courtroom, right? Because it's the job of the two parties to be more close to the truth. But you're really trying to take that neutral approach and say, objectively, if I had a 30,000-foot view, knowing all the considerations, I think that's less of an egotistical approach, is how I would describe it from a psychological perspective.
Egocentric, for sure. I mean, when parties are in a dispute, their perspective, and I do it too. I mean, if you're in a dispute with someone, your perspective is affected by biases that you may not even know you have, and your recollection of what happened and how it happened. It's extraordinary.
As 12 Angry Men.
As mediators, we get to hear both sides together, and oftentimes they're separate, and you speak with the two sides separately. You hear everybody's perspective of what's going on in the other room, And it's amazing how often, and I've got an article I swear I'm going to finish one day on narratives. It's amazing how often we have a picture in our minds of what that guy, that gal in the other room is thinking and what motivates them. And what I and other mediators have learned is most of the time that's wrong.
Yeah.
Partly it's based upon the fight or flight.
The projection of your own emotional state.
Yeah. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. System one is quick, it's absolutely confident, and it's rarely right.
Yeah.
System two is where we want people, after they've vented, to calm down, get the fight, flight, or freeze system out of you, and let's get you back to the prefrontal cortex, which is what we use, to analyze. System two, analytical thinking, is what brings us to a resolution. And oftentimes what we do as mediators is make sure that system two, when it's finally working, isn't being wasted explaining why system one was a good idea. I went with my gut because CO was right. Well, no. We all know you were wrong. And let's get past that and see what we can do to move things forward.
With all the experience and learning that you've done, not just in the law, right? That's part of it, but in the human condition, in human nature, what are some things that if you could go back to that Annapolis restaurant waiter, right? And you could say, you could be the person who gave you the internship, right? You switch chairs with that person. I think this is an interesting thing. How would that conversation go now?
Well,
not saying you change anything, but just like if you were that guy now.
First of all, I would have to say there's a long list of people I owe apologies to, because nothing is more certain than the confidence of youth. And luckily for me, whoever wrote the book on emotional intelligence did it early enough for me to pay attention and gave me enough time to start improving. But it really was just a question of, I wanted to be a lawyer and this is what it took, but I didn't know what kind of lawyer. I had there was some dispute going on in my high school, and the principal set up a group to review it and put me in charge of the group. I don't know why. And I guess that was maybe the first mediation I was involved in. And then when the principal found out what our solutions were, he tried to stop us from publishing it. So it was an interesting experience. But I think I'm glad that my path took me into mediation, because everybody likes to do something that they really enjoy, and that's how it worked.
Yeah.
When I was working in that restaurant, there was maybe 5 guys in California and Minnesota thinking about mediation, and that was it.
So you might have been able to start the ground floor. The extra 15 years between when you got involved in mediation to when inception, maybe you would have just been earlier.
I don't think that would have ever happened. If I'd have been a more grown up young man at the time, I might have had more success as a litigator, and maybe stayed in that path.
Interesting.
I mean, that's one of the things that we find when we engage with people that we're in a dispute with, is oftentimes we don't know what it is that set them off in the first place. And I've also seen many, many times when a case resolves after everybody's had a chance to talk and be heard, and it resolves with an actual settlement that nobody planned going in. You're going into a negotiation, usually you have your high and your low and what you're willing to accept.
Sure, you have your range.
But then, and I've seen it happen with my own clients, when a mediator ran things properly, process-centered, and the client walks away delighted with something that they would have fired me for suggesting a week before. Because when you
Man.
when you enable people to decide what's best, and they're able to, and they finally have put aside what brought them
Sure.
to the cage.
Sure.
You know, it's pretty surprising sometimes what a solution is.
To make the analogy with the cage, I think it's just so interesting. The emotional response or reaction to what you just stated. The amount of times that I've met personally people that are professional cage fighters, and even on larger scale, like just the average, you'd see that some people want to have this like personal vendetta. They look for reasons to have anger towards their opponent to justify.
What's my motivation?
They try to find an external motivation aside from the competitive aspect that you're competing for a prize and for an audience and for entertainment and like sport. So they try to make it a personal thing, but then a substantially large subset of the population that does engage in cage fighting, they can be best friends with the person after they fought. They'll give them a hug and say, thank you, I appreciate you. Like there's this shared moment of camaraderie that you would never get. And it's like, it's both emotional feelings can be real, but just in different order. Like after you've quite honestly, I don't want to use curse words, but beaten the ego out of one another. I was going to say a different word.
Yeah.
And they can be friends. And it sounds like that can, I don't want to say friends after mediation, but you can be civil.
Yeah, people can, sometimes in mediation, and my own clients, you're in a dispute with a supplier whose supplies you need. And, if we go down the lawsuit route, one of us is going to have an uncollectible judgment potentially, and both of us are going to have lost a business relationship. And it's not always the case, but sometimes the business relationship can turn out to be more important than the dispute. Sometimes when businesses have a dispute, ownership doesn't know anything about it until they come to the mediation table. Because middle management is what created the dispute. And again, about narratives, what's that guy's motivation? Well, that guy's motivation was, to protect his boss. And his boss is like, what do you mean? I don't need protecting. Well, why are we here? I'm
right.
kind
As
of
an example.
Those kind of things you just don't know until you can get people to sit down and exchange ideas. And that's happening more and more nationally and in Pennsylvania with the growth of mediation. Now, and I should say that the founders of mediation, the psychologists, the sociologists, the peacemakers who sought and still seek a process that works in neighborhoods, that works internationally, that works cross-culturally, they're frustrated with their view of what lawyers and judges did with a good process. But I see more and more today judges and lawyers coming to this process because they see how it can work and can be useful for their clients. A lot of magistrate judges who get the neighborhood dispute cases brought in front of them use mediation all the time. They send people to mediation because they recognize that a facilitated negotiation among neighbors is much better than continual lawsuits.
It's like instead of building higher walls, you make a longer table.
Strong fences make good neighbors, but if the fence is low enough for you to lean across and talk with each other, that can maybe be better.
That's a great analogy. Well, David, I want to ask you one final question, not super deep. Where can people reach out to you, whether it's your writing, whether it's connect with you, just to have a conversation, or maybe seek your services? How can people get a hold of you?
Best place to start is with my website, adrfitz.com, adrfitz.com, and all the contact information is on there and abilities to reach me.
Wonderful. Everyone listening, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. It proved to be a valuable brainstorm. My only ask, and all I ask in the show, is if you did enjoy the show, share it with a friend. It's one way the show grows. Thanks so much. Until next time.